Much Ado About Nothing, the nothingness of God in Christian and Jewish mysticism. Believers of the three monotheistic faiths accept God as the supreme reality. God is being itself, ultimate truth, absolute goodness, transcendental beauty, or whatever other attributes humans have used for the origin, foundation, and goal of all things. God is the totality, the all, as opposed to the imperfection, the limitation, the nothing of everything else. This is well expressed by John of the Cross, whose feast day it happens to be, coincidentally, when he expresses a contrast between the todo and the nada, that is, his insistence that it is only by letting go of all created nothingness, nada, that we can begin to approach the divine wholeness, the todo. I'll quote just one famous passage from the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1. To reach satisfaction in all, desire satisfaction in nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing. To come to the knowledge of all, desire the knowledge of nothing. What then can it mean to speak of God as nothing, as nada, or as nihil? And yet a number of mystics, both in Christianity and Judaism, as well as other traditions, I believe, have done so. But is this merely a kind of language game designed to show how clever and transgressive mystics can be? Does it make any sense to name God as nothing? Is it all a bit of much ado about nothing? I will argue that speaking of God as nothing is more than just some otiose exercise, however strange it may look at first glance. The mystics, both of the Christian and the Jewish traditions, who use such language were not playing games. Rather, they were trying to say something about the radical insufficiency of all efforts to name God. Given the comparative theme of the conference, I think it's worth investigating why and how some Christian and Jewish mystics felt impelled to wrestle with the nothingness of God. But before I get into that, I want to make a note about my understanding of comparative mysticism. First of all, I would suggest that the fruitful study of mysticism today demands comparison. In the current ecumenical situation, what the late Ewart Cousins once called the era of global spirituality, investigating only one mystical tradition in isolation may produce helpful results, but I believe they'll be limited. It's primarily on the basis of the comparative study of the variety of mystical traditions that I think the most creative work will emerge. We live in a religiously plural world, and without commitment to an ecumenical perspective on mysticism, I think we're liable to engage in repeating the past, not forging the future. To be sure, few scholars will ever be equally competent in more than one tradition. But what I'm talking about is different. It's the commitment to serious study and appreciation of at least one other tradition other than one's own. Secondly, by way of introduction, in my own comparative work, which has largely involved the relation of Jewish and Christian mysticism, I've gradually worked out an approach to comparison that I call mystical dynamics, for want of a better term. And this is different from two popular modes of comparison that I describe, perhaps not fairly, as the common core approach and the typological approach. The common core approach of philosophers like W.T. Stace, Ninian Smart, Robert Foreman tries to find the essence or common core of all mystical experience by comparing accounts from diverse texts and traditions that seem to be saying the same thing. The typological approach of investigators like Rudolf Otto and R.C. Zahner, again I'm naming just a few, distinguishes various broad types of mysticism that can be found across religious traditions. I'm not going to say more about those approaches here. They're certainly valuable, but I think they also have certain drawbacks. What I'm calling comparative dynamics is more limited in scope. because it investigates forms of mysticism that were related in heritage and history, that were subject to the action of many of the same broad causes, and that at times even had mutual influence on each other. Obviously, in the case of Christianity, the only historical contenders for such comparisons would be Judaism and Islam. Thus, for example, we can study the mystical hermeneutics of Jewish and Christian authors because they apply many of the same techniques or similar techniques to their sacred texts, the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, often with surprising similarities and just as striking divergences. How does the practice of reading the Bible work within the dynamic structure of the two traditions? And what do the similarities and differences tell us about the nature of Jewish and Christian mysticism? The purpose of comparative dynamics is not to argue that there is some common core that unites Jewish and Christian mysticism, or to identify types of Jewish and Christian mysticism, but rather to strive for a deeper understanding of the other tradition from within, as well as to learn things about one's own tradition that are easily overlooked or missed unless we try to see it through the eyes of others. Among the good candidates for comparative dynamics, for example, is what I call divine structures, or perhaps better, divine systems. Both Judaism and Christianity, and as well Islam, insist on the absolute oneness and unity of God. The Lord your God is one God. Nevertheless, Christianity in general, and Judaism, at least in some of its mystical aspects, introduce, if not real multiplicity, at least dynamic interactivity into the one God. Christianity is founded on the belief that the one God is a trinity of persons. In Kabbalah, the 10 Sephirot, or divine powers, form an emanative system of different levels of divine reality by which the unknowable Ein Sof manifests itself both in the upper realm and in the realm of creation. The Jewish tradition, of course, attacked Christians for introducing a threeness into God. The Sephirotic system, although accepted by many Jews, those who studied the mystics, was denounced by some of the conservative rabbis as worse than Christianity because it postulated 10 gods rather than one God, or rather than 3. I submit that there is a rich field of possible comparison between Christian views of the inner life of the three persons in the Trinity and how they affect the mystic, and the way in which the Kabbalists conceive of the activity of the various Sephirotic powers helping humans to restore harmony to the world above and the world below. Now, this is a vast area of comparative research and one that is vastly complicated. What I'd like to do in this talk is just to make an initial exploration of the originating point of inner divine activity in Christianity and Judaism, specifically with regard to the way in which naming God as nothing has been conceived of as the origination of the Trinitarian process and also of the Sephirotic emanation. So I'm going to briefly look at 3 Christian examples and 3 Jewish examples before turning to some comparative reflections at the end. Speaking of God as nothing, no thing, Uden, Nihil, is certainly a form of negative or apophatic theology, but there are many theologians who are deeply apophatic, think of Thomas Aquinas or John of the Cross, who never use such language. For these thinkers, God is radically unknowable, and the cataphatic names we use for God are always insufficient, but nothing is not appropriate as a name for God because these thinkers and many others conceive of nothing as a nothingness, as a lack or privation, Aristotle's notion of steresis. In order for nihil, nothing, to become a name for God, it was necessary to develop a notion of nihil by excess or eminence. That is, God can be appropriately called nihil, not because he is less than things, but because he is more than any and every something. Plato had spoken of the good beyond being and the unlimited one. And by the time of Plotinus, the incomprehensible one had emerged as fully infinite. Philo, the first-century Jewish thinker who first put together biblical faith and Greek philosophy, never denied that superlative terms like the good or the existent could be applied to God, but he insisted that we cannot understand what they mean when we apply them to God. So he tended to use hyperlanguage, like that found in many later mystical theologians, as when he says, I cite just one text here, that God is better than the good, more excellent than the excellent, more blessed than blessedness, and any perfection that may be greater than these. But Philo never took the step of naming the better or the beyond nothing. Even Clement of Alexandria, the first Christian apophatic theologian, the first to claim that God is best known by not knowing, does not refer to God as nothing. It was Pseudo-Dionysius who first began to edge towards the language of no thing regarding the divine source that lies beyond affirmation and negation and yet is manifested as Trinity and created theophany. In his Divine Names 5:9, as Dionysius wrestles with unnaming the unnameable, he says, God is the boundary to all things and is the unbounded infinity about them in a way that is above the contradiction between finite and infinite. He proceeds into everything while yet remaining within himself. He is at rest and moving. He is neither resting nor moving, and he has neither source nor middle nor end. He is not in any created thing, nor a being of the things that have being, nor a being of the things that have being. Dionysius goes further in Book 7 of the Divine Names, where he notes that the theologians customarily apply negative terms to God, but, and I quote here, contrary to the usual sense of deprivation. So the negative terms like nothing used of God are contrary to deprivation in the Aristotelian sense. So to negate terms of God does not indicate defect, but rather moves toward an eminent view of nothing, as becomes clear later in chapter 7, where he says, God is not one of the things that are, and he cannot be known in any of them. He is all things in all things, and he is nothing in nothing. I don't intend to take Dionysius as one of my three Christian God-no-thingers, but rather I want to look at three later figures who said more about the divine no-thing. The first is John Scotus Eriugena, who translated the Dionysian corpus into Latin and whose Perifusion was deeply indebted to the enigmatic Areopagite. I think that the basic reason why the Irish scholar was able to create a systematic account of God as no thing was rooted in the fact that he intended his Perifusion to be a universal presentation of the whole of reality, what he called the genus generalissimum of natura, physis, which he defined as all the things that are and the things that are not, omnium quae sunt et quae non sunt. Eriugena divided this universal genus into its four appropriate species. First, that which creates and is not created. Second, that which is created and also creates. Third, that which is created and does not create. And fourth, that which neither creates nor is created. Note in this division the inclusion of both positive terms, being, and negative terms, not being. When John begins to discuss the five modes of understanding the basic distinction between the things that are and the things that are not, we can see him working to exclude the understanding of the things that are not in terms of mere lack or privation. Quote here from a text in Book 1. For what somehow appears to be a mode of division based on privations of substances and accidents should not be admitted. For how can that which absolutely is not and cannot be, and which does not surpass the intellect, be included in the divisions of things? So divisions of things has negativity, but it's not negativity by way of deprivation. In other words, if natura is really the most general of all categories, it demands a non-privative or a super-essential nihil in order to ground the whole structure. This insight enabled John to redefine the meaning of creation from nothing, creatio ex nihilo. Christianity, of course, had rejected classical views of the origin of the universe as either a co-eternal but dependent reality, that's Aristotle, or something made, either eternally or temporally, out of a principle other than God, such as matter, and that's Plato. For Christians, the universe is totally dependent on God's free choice, and also God brought it forth without dependence on anything else. Earlier understandings of creatio ex nihilo, you can trace back to about the 2nd century of the Common Era, saw nihil as a total lack of existence, a kind of intellectual surge, something that functioned as the reverse of the supremacy of God's power. Eriugena, however, maintained that creatio ex nihilo meant the total dependence of the universe on the unknowable God understood as nihil. All things come forth from the no thing that is God. Eriugena bases this claim on his analysis of the ways of speaking about God detailed in Book 1 of Periphysion. Positive or cataphatic language about God is always metaphorical because God is nothing of the things that are. Negative language is true, but it provides no information. Therefore, the best way of speaking about God is by hyperlanguage, terms like superessentialis, superbeing. These terms are positive in form, but still negative in content. As he says in Periphysion, speaking of superessentialis, the word says that God is not one of the things that are, but that he is more than the things that are. But what that is it in no way defines. The payout of this doctrine comes in Book 3 of Periphysion in the midst of a long discussion of what it means to call God nothing. Eriugena says, the divine goodness which is called nothing for the reason that beyond all the things that are and that are not, it is found in no essence, descends from the negation of all essences into the affirmation of the essence of the whole universe, from itself into itself, as though from nothing into something. Thus Eriugena, following Dionysius, has no hesitation in calling God the essence of all things, the essentia omnium, a term which, to the unwary who do not understand the dialectic of immanence and transcendence in natura, might seem like pantheism, but which is really the opposite. The fact that John spends such a long time exploring God as nihil does seem to show that he was aware of how strange this teaching would sound to many. But his dialectical view of the relation between the hidden no-thingness of God and the divine manifestation, the theophany of creation, was, I think, central to his whole intellectual edifice. It comes to expression in many ways, notably in the famous series of 19 antitheses, again from Book 3, which begins by stating, everything that is understood and sensed is nothing else but the non-apparent's appearance, the hidden's manifestation, the negated's affirmation. Non apparentis apparitio, occulti manifestatio, negati affirmatio. The initial subjective genitive in each of these phrases, non apparentis, for example, expresses the hidden divine nothingness, while the positive nominative indicates God as both proceeding and returning in the theophanic universe. Thus, we might paraphrase the third antithesis, negati affirmatio, as saying, the coming forth from what is negated, that is the nihil, is the affirmation that moves back towards the goal that is also its source. Eriugena's radical apophatic view of God as nihil had profound implications for his view of humanity as imago Dei, image of God, because it means that humans in their deepest level are as unknowable as God, implying that the human nature in reality is also a nothing, a no thing, a nihil, although Eriugena does not generally use that kind of language. The Dominican preacher Meister Eckhart is my second example. He also had a highly developed notion of God as nihil or nichts. Eckhart knew some of Eriugenes' writings through the Parisian school text of the Corpus Dionysiacum, which included glosses and scholia from the Irish scholar. But Eriugenes' view of the nothingness of God is very much his own creation out of his Neoplatonically influenced speculations. In Eckhart's dialectic, God both is, that is, exists in a perfect and eminent sense as puritas essendi, and God is not. That is, God is totally beyond existent reality as we know it and name it. Like Dionysius and Eriugena, Eckhart implies ways of talking about God as beyond both affirmation and negation within a dialectical framework of distinction, indistinction, similarity, dissimilarity, eating, hungering, and a range of other opposed terms. That is to say, since God is the being whose distinction from everything else is his indistinction, or the one whose difference from all else is the fact that he is not different or not other, therefore, the more distinct God is, the more indistinct he is, and vice versa. Famous text in Eckhart's commentary on the Book of Wisdom, chapter 7. Although ordinary Aristotelian language works within the realm of particular things, created things, the this and that, as Eckhart called them, in the case of God, who is not a thing at all, it fails. We must, however, use human terms in speaking about God, but we only use them with the aim of destroying them in their very employment. Eckhart has a variety of ways of pursuing this deconstructive program. Some stress identity language, such as his insistence that God's ground is the soul's ground and the soul's ground is God's ground. Other ways feature dialectical expressions of negation, especially the negation of negation, the negatio negationis, versagendes versagenes. Eckhart did not create the category of negation. It's found as early as Proclus, but he made it central to his teaching, mostly in his Latin works, but we do find it also in one or two of the German sermons. Let me cite German Sermon 21. He says, "A master says, one is the negation of negation. If I say God is good, this adds something to him. One is a negation of negation and a denial of denial. One means something to which nothing has been added. All creatures have a negation in themselves, because one creature denies that it is the other creature. But God has a negation of negation. He is one and negates everything else, for outside of God there is nothing." The negation of negation is nothing else but the affirmation of the eminent nothingness of the divine nature. It should be clear by now that nihil, dialectically conceived, has what I call reversing polarities when ascribed to God and to created things. If we say that created things are, we must say that God is not. But if we affirm the unknowable supremacy of God as a negatio negationis, then created things are nothing in themselves, but depend totally on the divine being. Eckhart works with this dialectic across his writings, nowhere more brilliantly than in his German Sermon 71, which is preached on the text from Acts 9:8. Saul rose from the ground and with eyes open saw nothing. Eckhart begins by identifying four kinds of nothingness implicit in the account of Saul's conversion. I quote here, "One meaning is, when he got up from the ground with eyes open, he saw nothing, and the nothing was God. The second meaning, when he got up, he saw nothing but God. The third meaning, in all things he saw nothing but God. The fourth, when he saw God, he viewed all things as nothing." As you can see, Eckhart moves from God as eminent nothingness, expressed in numbers 1 through 3, to creatures as defective nothing in number 4. The course of this sermon primarily explores the nothing that is God. As Eckhart says, Paul saw the nothing which was God. God is a nothing and God is a something. Whatever is something is also nothing. Reflecting on nothing as language about God, Eckhart goes on to say, when the soul comes into the one and there enters into the pure rejection of itself, it finds God as in a nothing. He continues what looks like a rare self-reference. It seemed to a man as though he were in a dream. It was a waking dream, that he became pregnant with nothing as a woman does with a child, and in this nothing God was born. He was the fruit of the nothing. God was born in the nothing. Although Sermon 71 is Eckhart's most sustained exploration of the divine nothingness, it's found in many other sermons. I won't cite them here. There's another important dimension to God's nothingness in Eckhart that can only be mentioned here. Eckhart characterizes God as intelligere, understanding more than being, esse. In his Parisian Questions, for example, he states, I declare it is not my present opinion that God understands because he exists, but that he exists because he understands. God is an intellect and understanding, and his understanding is the ground of his existence. Intellect's primacy is based on its ability to know all things, which shows that taken in itself, intellect cannot be a thing that is a created particularity. Because it is not a thing, it cannot be conceptualized. Rather, intellect is the capacity to conceive of and therefore to create all things, pure possibility, nothing. Since humans possess intellect as the imago Dei, then they too share in this form of nothingness. So from the perspective of our created particularity, we're nothing in the defective sense, but from the perspective of our intellect, qua intellect, we are nothing in the eminent sense. The third Christian author I'll take up more briefly is Jakob Böhme, the Lutheran layman, theosophical mystic, who produced one of the most fascinating bodies of Christian mystical texts. In this context, I can only look at one aspect of Böhme's dense, emanative account of the procession of all things from the hidden and unknown ultimate source. And this will be his teaching on the Ungrund. It's not found in his earliest works, in the Aurora. But we begin to find from the works starting around 1619, that is the three principles of divine beings, what I'm referring to here, we find an account of the origin of evil that roots it in the divine nature and begins to talk more directly about that nature as nothing. I quote, he, God, is a spirit, and before our eyes he is like a nothing. Hence, if we did not know him from creation, we would know nothing of him. If he had not become from all eternity, he would be nothing at all. In this work, for the first time in Böhme, the divine will comes to the fore as the force that impels the nothing God to come to outward manifestation and to self-knowledge. In the contemporary work, The 40 Questions on the Soul, Böhme, for the first time, uses his neologism for this God beyond God, the nothing from which all things come. He calls it the Ungrund, the no ground, the on-ground, Ungrund. And Ungrund appears in almost all of his later works, and I think is the key to Böhme's mature negative theology. Discussing the origin of the soul, this is question 1 in the 40 questions, Böhme's exposition focuses on 10 forms of fire, which some have seen as reflecting the 10 Sephirot of the Kabbalists. The first form of fire is the pre-cosmic will, which sees and desires only itself. The second form features this Ungrund. Somehow, will begins to seek a model of itself and becomes pregnant. Böhme tries to explain how the will, as a nothingness in itself, constitutes itself by using the image of an eye gazing into the mirror of itself. He says, it is all things and yet is nothing. It beholds itself, and yet it finds nothing but an auga, which is its eye. Auga, that is the eternal origin from something, that the eternal origin that something is, for it is an eternal beginning and an eternal end. Thus the Ungrund sees in itself and finds itself. Burma's neologism marks a new moment in Christian views of the nothingness of God, one that is difficult to interpret. The term might be paraphrased as the ungraspable non-ground. Nicholas Berdyaev spoke of it as an absolutely original freedom, something that is not even the meontic freedom determined by God. The Ungrund seems more like the place or no place where freedom, at least as we can conceive it, arises. It's whence. It is also an eternal nothing. As Burma says in a text from the Pansophical Mystery, again I quote, "The Ungrund is an eternal nothing, but it makes an eternal craving, Sucht, for nothing is a craving after something. Because there is nothing that can give anything, the craving itself is the giving of it, and yet it is a nothing as purely desiring craving. It makes something out of nothing, and that only in itself." I don't have time here to pursue the meaning of Berdyaev's Ungrund as what I would call the pre-divine nothing, a limitless neediness seeking to find itself. The texts, I hope, are sufficient to indicate its difference, however, from the eminent divine superessential nihil in Eriugena and Eckhart, because rather than an overwhelming but unknown transcendent fullness, Burma's Ungrund is a primordial neediness, the indeterminate desire to come to knowledge of itself and to manifest itself in creation. So if I've been speaking so far about two kinds of nothingness, nothingness by defect and nothingness by eminence, Burma's Ungrund does not seem to fit either of these very well. Perhaps we need to identify a third form of nothingness, the nothingness of neediness and desire, Sucht. Now to turn to Jewish texts more briefly. The Hebrew Bible speaks of the hiddenness of God, and early Jewish Merkavah mysticism had a role for a negative theology and a hidden God. Nevertheless, characterizing God as nothing does not feature in Jewish mysticism, as far as I know, before the rise of Kabbalah in the mid-12th century, first in Provence and then in Catalonia. The origins of the Kabbalah remain murky. Gershom Scholem's book of that title saw early Kabbalah as a challenge to the philosophical Judaism of Moses Maimonides, one that combined Gnostic elements present in early Jewish traditions with Neoplatonic themes. But the debate continues among scholars of Jewish mysticism about the background and the meaning of the various forms of Kabbalah from the 12th through to the 14th centuries. Speaking of God as nothing, Jewish mysticism is tied to the appearance of a new term, Ein Sof, literally the without end, a technical term for the incomprehensibility of the infinite God. Closely related to this new term was a shift in the understanding of the word ayin, the biblical term meaning nothing in the privative sense, or sometimes where. The early Kabbalists absorbed ayin into their language of the Sephirotic system, making it a kind of manifestation, or one of the manifestations of Ein Sof, the unknown and unknowable source. In that sense, ayin becomes the nothing that can be named. I'll quote just a text or two. Late 13th century Kabbalist Joseph Chikatilo says, "The depth of the primordial being is called boundless. It is also called ayin because of its concealment from all creatures above and below. If one asks, what is it? The answer is ayin. That is, no one can understand anything about it." The 14th century Kabbalist David ben Abraham Halavan explicitly invokes nothingness by way of eminence. Nothingness, ayin, is more existent than all the being of the world, since it is simple, and all simple things are complex compared with its simplicity. So it is called ayin. Given the bibliocentric and linguocentric nature of Jewish mysticism, the new understanding of ayin found a scriptural source, oddly enough, in a famous quotation from the book of Job, Job 28:12, where is wisdom to be found? Where is wisdom to be found? But the where here is me'ayin. The answer is that wisdom, often conceived of as the first of the Sephirot, comes from nothingness. Thus, another Kabbalist, Asher ben David, says, the inner power is called ayin because neither thought nor reflection can grasp it. Concerning this, Job said, wisdom comes into being out of ayin. So an eminent sense of nothing, naught, emerged in early Kabbalah and took its place in Jewish mystical speculation. This evolution, of course, is very complex. Here I'll make only a few comments about two Kabbalistic authors. First is Azriel of Herona, roughly 1180 to 1250. And then I'll say just a little bit about the Zohar and the person who seems to be its major, not its only author, Moshe de Leon, roughly 1240 to 1305. Under the influence of Isaac the Blind and other Provençal Kabbalists, Azrael developed a highly sophisticated form of mysticism. To quote Joseph Dahn, Rabbi Azriel's work represents an important step in the systematization of Kabbalistic symbolism and its application to various aspects of Jewish religious life. With Azriel, we also enter into the complex question of the possible influence of Christian Neoplatonic systems, specifically that of Eriugena, on early Kabbalah. Scholem proposed that Azriel, or at least some of his circle, knew Latin and had knowledge of Periphysion. Other scholars have taken the suggestion even further, but there has been a pushback by scholars who found any question of direct dependence highly unlikely, despite the Neoplatonic cast of Azriel's thought. Rabbi Azriel's view of the divine nothingness is difficult. In his explanation of the 10 Sephirot, Azriel describes the infinite Ein Sof in personal terms as the ruler of the world, although the philosophers admit to this fact that the cause of all things, I'm quoting here, and the origins is infinite, unfathomable, and without limit, and is absolutely undifferentiated in a complete and changeless unity. He continues, he is the essence of all that is concealed and revealed. And as the philosophers say, our perception of him cannot be known except by way of negative attribution. That's, of course, Maimonides. That which radiates forth from Ein Sof, continues Azrael, are the 10 Sephirot, which he describes as the first limitation of Ein Sof's unlimited power. They are perfected power insofar as they flow from the source, imperfect power when the flow is withdrawn. In his discussions of the emanative process, Azrael employs the language of the transformation of nothing, sometimes ayin, sometimes fs, into something, yesh. But it's not always clear whether we're talking about a philosophical notion of nothing as privation or a mystical notion of eminent no-thingness. It is evident, however, that Azrael thought that God created being out of his own no-thingness. In response to the question how God could bring forth being from nothing, he says, he who thereby brings forth being from nothing is thereby lacking in nothing, for the being is in the nothing in the manner of the nothing, and the nothing is in the being after the manner of the being. And of this, the author of the book Yetzirah said, he made his nothing into his being. He did not say he made the being from the nothing, to indicate that the nothing is the being, yesh, of the being, and the being is the nothing. Being is therefore nothing but a nothing, and everything is one in the simplicity of absolute indistinctness. I can't go into any of the details of Azrael's view of the emanation of the Sephirot here, especially the respective roles of divine will and divine wisdom, but I do want to note that he teaches that the goal of the mystical study and prayer of the Kabbalists is to ascend back to the divine nothingness, to come to what he calls annihilation of thought. So let me turn here to the world of the Zohar. In the next generation, the center of Kabbalistic speculation shifted to Castile, where a circle of mystical adepts put together the massive Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Splendor. This was sometime in the last quarter of the 13th century, although the work contains numbers of layers, and was edited, refined, added to for more than a century. Prominent among these authors was Rabbi Moshe de Leon, who in his other Kabbalistic writings gives witness to a theme that we have already seen in Ariuja and Eckhart, that is the eminent no-thingness as realized both in the hidden God and in human beings as the imago Dei. In the vast poetic, symbolic, and speculative world that is the Zohar, I will only note 3 texts briefly that are central to the role of God as no thing. The first comes from early in the book, the commentary on Genesis 1:1. It's revealing the beginning of the emanation of the Sephirotic system. Bereshit bara ha-Elohim, in the beginning God created. At the beginning of the section called the Parashat ha-Bereshit, we find the following enigmatic text. If you think the stuff so far has been complex, listen to this one. At the head of the potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed forth within the concealed of the concealing. From the head of infinity, a cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring, not white, not black, no color at all. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, concealed within the mystery of Ein Sof. It did and did not split its aura, was not known at all, until under the impact of the splitting, a single concealed supernal point shone. Beyond the point, nothing is known. It is called Reshit, beginning. Daniel Matt, in his translation, notes to this, paraphrases this as meaning, with the beginning, the ineffable source created Elohim. And each of those are references to various elements in the Sephirotic system. Now, this passage obviously concerns the unknown divine source as the origin of the emanative process, but is the source a no thing? I think we can answer in positive fashion on the basis of some later texts. And I'll cite just one here. Commentary from Leviticus 6:1-2, where Rabbi Shimon, the pseudonym as a revealer of the Zohar, responds to a question of his son, Rabbi Eliezer, asking how far can devotion ascend? How far can your devotion go up in the system of the Sephirot? His answer, as we have established, it can go to Ein Sof. For all binding, union, and consummation are to be secreted in that secrecy ungrasped and unknown, containing will of all wills. Ein Sof is not susceptible of being known, nor does it produce end or anything as primordial ayin generates beginning and end. Who is beginning? But there, Ein Sof, no end, no wills, no light, no lamps, and that Ein Sof. The one who knows and does not know is none but supernal will, concealed of all concealed. It is ayin. And when the supernal point and the world that is to come ascend, they know only the aroma, as one inhaling an aroma is sweetened. Ein Sof, at least according to the interpreters of these difficult texts, here appears as an unknown and unnameable no thing. Well, ayin or Keter, the first of the Sephirah, is the divine will, that is the no thing that can begin to be named. And I cite several later passages from later sections of the Zohar here, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to move ahead. And I also said, of course, that I would take up 3 Christian and 3 Jewish authors. My final figure from Judaism would come from the world of Hasidic mysticism, particularly the Chabad Hasidism of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Hasidism features a psychologization of the nothingness of ayin in the soul of the sage who strives to attain self-annihilation. But our time grows short, and so I'll do no more than mention Rabbi Shneur here, but I hope that in the final version of this paper, I could say something about him as well. So I'm going to move to some concluding remarks. These 2 are going to have to be brief. In contrast to ancient thinking, even the philosophical mysticism of the Platonic tradition, Christianity and later Judaism created a new philosophical mystical category, the no-thingness of eminence. That is, God as the unknown and unknowable origination, whose reality is best, if always insufficiently, expressed by terms like nihil and ayin, words that have no determined conceptual content, but that serve as dialectical markers for the unknown. Both Judaism and Christianity root these understandings in the Bible or specific biblical texts. The text from Job, or the text from Saul getting up from the ground and seeing nothing. These, of course, surprise the modern reader. They're not exactly historical, critical readings, one might say, but they're quite conformable to how mystics have always been strong readers, even recreators of the biblical text. In both traditions, not unsurprisingly, the divine nothingness also has a resonance in the core of the human person conceived of as imago Dei. That is, the realization of eminent nihil inside of us is one way to conceive of the goal of the mystical path. And this is true certainly for the Jewish mystics that I've looked at, as well as mystics like Eriugena and Eckhart, perhaps not for Burma. Obviously, the differences are many between Christian and Jewish mystical uses of eminent nothingness, as even this brief account has shown. What's more revealing, or at least revealing, I think, are the functional similarities. These mystics, both Christian and Jewish mystics, invite the reader, the hearer, in the words of the famous Eckhartian poem, the Granum Sanapis, "Sink all mein Ich in Gottes nicht, sink in die grundlose Flut." Sink all my I, my Ich, into the divine Nicht, the divine nothingness. Sink into the bottomless flood. That's where it all ends. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Peter Tyler from St. Mary's. Thank you so much, Bernie. That was a wonderful, rich starter. Perhaps this is a theme of Rabbi Shur's that you were going to develop, and I saw it as a thread going through, which is, there were two phrases that hit me. One was from Eriugena, the human being is unknown in God, this idea of the possibility of unknowing at the heart of the human person. The other was from Rabbi Moshe de Leon, the nothingness in the human being as the imago Dei. Could you say a little bit more about that? I found it very exciting.
Yeah. I think it's one of the major themes, really, certainly in the history of Christian mysticism, and I think it's strong in Judaism. As I said, I don't pretend to be so much of an expert in Jewish mystical traditions. But in Christianity, it is, of course, rooted in what is shared with Judaism, Genesis 1:26. Humans alone are created in the image and likeness of God. And what does it mean, therefore, to say that we are created in the image and likeness of God? And at first with Gregory of Nyssa, who has a deeply apophatic doctrine of God, begins to recognize if humans are imago and God is unknown, humans must also be unknown. There is a radical apophatic anthropology based upon the whole notion of imago Dei. So you find it in Gregory of Nyssa, and it's very richly developed, particularly in Eriugena. And I think without as much of a systematic presentation, we also find it in Eckhart, we find it in Nicholas of Cusa, and in various ways. So that we are most like God in the fact that we are a mystery that is an unknowable mystery. And if we're really imago, the imago character is based upon the negativity rather than any positivity. And what I was surprised at in working on this paper and in reading elsewhere is that there are certainly elements of this present in a number of the Jewish mystics as well. I'm not yet at the point to say that it's the same kind of trajectory that one can find in Christianity, but I think certainly in Rabbi Azriel, in Moshe de Leon, and in Schneur, Rabbi Schneur, we find that. So I think this has been overlooked, not completely overlooked, but I think it's a central theme, really, in the history of Christian mysticism. I'm beginning to think also in Jewish mysticism as well.
Hi, I'm William Franke, and I have one rather technical curiosity sort of question, and then if I could, I would like to raise an issue of method, and historical method applied to mysticism is an interesting and difficult and complicated issue that I think you touched on with language like comparative dynamics of traditions. There's a lot to be explored there, but just first the more technical question about Ungrund in Burma. I think I maybe heard neologism for that, whereas I thought I had read that word, or Ungrund in the Mittelhochdeutsch of Meister Eckhart. Am I wrong in...
Abgrund and Grund. In Eckhart we find Abgrund and Grund. Yes. We never find Ungrund.
Ungrund, okay. With a T, all right, well...
Yeah, D or T, I mean, in that sense. But Eckhart's term Grund,
yes,
and Abgrund are really central to his characterization, but I have never found the term Ungrund or Ungrund in Eckhart.
Okay, you used grundlos in what you quoted. Grundlos. But okay, I've been under a misimpression. I don't know exactly where I picked that up, but I usually
there are, of course, very interesting similarities between Eckhart's notion of Grund and more rarely Abgrund and the Ungrund in Burma. A woman named Valerie Pectas has written a long book on this in French. I think there are very important differences between the two conceptions, as I tried to show here as well.
Right. So then the other question to explore, I don't see really a way of answering this except through an ongoing conversation, but in some ways history is antithetical to mysticism. History needs objects, things to talk about. Nothing is what history, at least prima facie, cannot really perceive. Although there is a history of nothing, Storia del Nulla by Sergio Givone. Philosophers will take that on. But in some ways, what you're doing is impossible. The history of the mystical, what really does not show itself in history. I mean, that's what makes it so provocative. At least, that's my methodological reflection. Yeah.
The language of mystics is always both cataphatic and apophatic. There is no mystic I know who is purely apophatic. If the history of mysticism were purely apophatic, we couldn't write it. But I think because the history of mysticism is a combination of the apophatic and the cataphatic, it is open to historical investigation. That would be my answer.
My name is Axel. So I have a question. I'm most familiar with Eriugena, and there's an interesting tension in Eriugena's thought, as you're aware, between sort of the Augustinian notion of nothing as deprivation, privation, and the nothing of sort of plusquam, of the more than, super, hyper. And I think for Augustine, there's a real sort of anthropological center for his understanding of nothing. That is, the nothingness of evil sort of brings us down. It draws us to evil, to sin. Sin has no efficient cause because it's a deficiency. And for Eriugena, there's the same sort of attractiveness to the nothing of God because it's infinite. It draws you into the more than, into the hyper. And in your reading, maybe you can speak a little bit of sort of the human consequences or the anthropological consequences of this sort of tension, it seems, that occurs in Eriugena's thought. And have you any comments on that? Because it seems like the human person is then capable of being attracted to two different nothings.
Yeah.
They're sort of cousins, or something like that. I don't know.
Or opposites.
Or opposites. Yeah. But it's interesting. I'm interested if you can comment a little bit about that. Perhaps.
Yeah.
Or do the other mystics that you study? Maybe that's a better question. Do they bring in this comparison between the nothing of privation and of plusquam and how sin is involved in that?
I think it's probably strongest in Eryugena. I mean, there's a very powerful doctrine of evil, especially in Burma. It's a very, very complicated doctrine because, like the Kabbalists, I mean, Burma roots evil in God in a very strong way. But with regard to Eryugena, Eryugena certainly knows, he's a combination, as you know, of Augustine and his Eastern sources, particularly Dionysius and also Gregory of Nyssa. And out of his Eastern sources, he develops the eminent sense of God as no thing, which he then also says includes the human as imago Dei, whereas out of Augustine, he recognizes that there is the negative, the evil of privation and sinfulness. So in one way, you might say Eckhart's intention is to draw his readers away from privative no-thingness, from sin, to the recognition of the eminent no-thingness, which they share with the divine. So you could say there's a very pastoral dimension hidden away in Eryugena's speculations, to continue on the line of your suggestion and your question. I never quite thought of it that way, but I think Eryugena had a salvational intention in writing Perifusion, and part of it would be the choice between two kinds of nothingness.
I'm Adam, student here at Glasgow University. I have a question about the place of Jesus Christ, the incarnate God, in regards to man-woman's image of God. So maybe using the biblical concepts of the self-emptying of Jesus Christ at the same time as him being the icon of the Father, as Colossians says. And I'm wondering, in a Burma sense, I think he talks about Jesus as being the great repairer, the great repairer, the one who repairs, in the sense that as when God became incarnate, he repaired his own image in man and woman through the act of the incarnation itself. So I wonder if you could comment a little on the place of Jesus Christ, his incarnation.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Probably easier to answer with regard to Eryugena and Eckhart, because they're sometimes accused, of lacking a kind of Christology. They have a very different kind of Christology. They have a cosmic Christology. They have a Christology which is intended from all eternity as the reparation and end of the created universe. It does not depend, except tangentially, on Adam's fall, etc., for all these kinds of thinkers. And for Eckhart, the reintegration process is because we become the Son of God in the same sense that Jesus is the Son of God. He takes on human nature, not a human person. So in taking on human nature in the incarnation, we become Jesus, which is one of the reasons that Eckhart can use that language of the birth of the Son in the soul in the same way that the Son is born in the Father. Now, this is one of the things that got Eckhart into difficulties. The answer, and Eckhart gives the answer in his various trials, both in Cologne and in Avignon, is that the answer is perspective. The answer is perspective. From one perspective, we are identical with the incarnate Son. From another perspective, we always remain created and different in our particularity. So, and Eckhart makes that quite explicit. He's talking, as he says, insofar as. So insofar as the Son has taken on human nature, we are one with the Son. Insofar as we are created particular beings, we are not identical. And I think the case in Eryugena is somewhat similar as well. So incarnation is central for both Eryugena and Eckhart. A Christology is central. It's not your usual medieval Christology. Take again the example of Eckhart. People say, well, what about Christ's suffering and death on the cross? For Eckhart, that's essential, but it's not late medieval passion mysticism. It's not the bloody Christ on the cross. It's Christ as the example of perfect detachment and humility as idealized in his sacrifice and in his death. So these are questions of differing forms of, if you will, incarnational theology, different forms of a passion mysticism, etc., where people like Eckhart and Eryugena stand outside what we think of as the kind of medieval mainstream. I wrote an article some years ago, was Eckhart Christologically challenged? because you read still in older works, well, there's not a role for Christ in much of Eckhart. There is.
For Eriugena, I do know that in his Periphysion, he openly states that the incarnation presupposes a theophanic cosmos, that you need a theophanic cosmos for the incarnation to actually function, as it were. And it's very interesting. And he also then defines theophany elsewhere actually as the descent of the Word.
Yep.
So he integrates the descent of the Word into his cosmology. And he goes so far as to say, all things are one, it's just that we can't see it. And he very explicitly then says, that's why the incarnate Word descends, to restore vision, which I think is a very unique incarnational theology for Eriugena, outside of sort of the more mainstream ideas of the purpose of the incarnation, where it was to restore vision. So I think Eriugena does integrate it. It's just that it's hard to see it because he talks about nothing so much.
I would agree. And again, it's part of a wider trajectory because it starts with Maximus the Confessor. We find it then strongly developed in Eriugena. You find it in Hildegard of Bingen, to cite some of the great women mystical theologians, and then you find it in Eckhart, and you find it in Cusa and a variety of people. So these are traditions that we've forgotten, and as we look back into these texts, we begin to see other rich possibilities that have been overlooked in the history of Christian thought, in the history of Christian mysticism.
Recently we had a student here who did a PhD on Eriugena, and his argument was that actually his familiarity with Platonism came from study in one of the schools of Baghdad, one of the Islamic schools. The second question is of a similar kind, that there's recent work in German, and I've forgotten the name of the author, arguing that key ideas in Eckhart come from Avicenna. And the third is about Burma, really, and the extent of his acquaintance with the Kabbalah. So, I mean, each of these figures, at least potentially, obviously there are all sorts of historical questions around each of those, is already in some way exemplifying this comparative dynamic.
Right. I would say no to the first two questions. I don't see any evidence whatsoever that Eriugena could have had knowledge of those kinds of Eastern sources, even chronologically. It might be very difficult. With regard to Burma, there's a rich literature that's still open-ended about how much Kabbalah he might have known. We know that there were people in his hometown of Görlitz who were interested in Kabbalah, and we know that rabbis who knew Kabbalah also visited Görlitz at those times. So there's a literature in German, there's a monograph by the name Schulpitz or something like that, and there's a variety of articles. I think we're just at the beginning, actually, of trying to ferret out how much Burma may or may not have known. One of the things, however, and I can close with this note, is that within the three traditions, the three monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, based in large part still on exegesis and also upon philosophical background, particularly in Platonic thought and Neoplatonic thought, we often find remarkable similarities that illustrate these dynamic kinds of processes that I've been discussing, dynamic structures and dynamic that don't have to depend upon historical connection, but that are their attempts to work out certain kinds of problems about how the one God relates to the world, to creation, to salvation, et cetera, using the resources that they had, which are many times the resources of the ancient philosophical traditions, especially the Platonic. So we wouldn't have to say, well, could he have known this? Could he have known that? To see at times remarkable dynamic similarities in structures.